Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Friday, which means it's time for How to Bass. And today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Fun stuff. And before I do that, I'm going to go into Xsplit, right-click on the thing, and disable exclusive window capture, so that I apparently mute everything. There it is. So that now when I hit drop-down menus, you should be able to see it. Yay, cool, good job. Good job, me. Alright, so this bass, doing a bunch of stuff, but it's all coming back from FM, just a citrus. You can see what it's doing here. It's just the one automation. I'm automating the X on the main page, which is doing the volume on most of these individually, and I guess nothing on this front guy, huh? Yeah, pretty much. It's a bit of a layer thing, because like you can see that everything is FMing everything else, but all three of them are going just straight out, and just the last oscillator is also just going out by itself. So they are doing things to each other, but we are also hearing them in individual steps and not just as one actual result, which by itself sounds like this. Let's look at the individual oscillators. So to kind of round everything off, after like all the individual things happen, we have this one just straight up saw wave. You can see here I have its volume linked to mod X, and I had the mod linked to mod X too, but that was an accident because I didn't mean to do that. That's why I see the tab lit up here. And I guess damping is actually on most of these things, apparently, by default, and I wasn't aware of that, but I'm also not totally sure what it's doing in this context, to be perfectly honest, but it's not hurting, so I'll leave it alone. The first oscillator is operated 1 by number 2. Now, when I made this oscillator, I did this by just FMing number 2 and number 4 together. Number 2 and number 1 together, where number 2 is ratio 4, as you see there, and number 1 is ratio 2, which means it's 1 octave higher. That's how the ratios work. If you're ever curious about the FM stuff, that when you mostly this pops up in FM things, but whenever you see the ratio when it comes to pitch, that's how you determine going up or down. Octaves up are twice the current value, and octaves down are half the current value. In this case, when you FM a signal by an octave higher, you get a square like harmonic result. You can kind of hear it. It's very light, and the reason why it's light is because, well, this result doesn't make any sense by itself. It's because it's also being like the fact that number 2 is FMing number 1 isn't really complete if it's not also being FM by number 3 and 4. However, these decisions about like what number 3 and 4 are doing were made kind of independently of each other, and that like the sequence of creating this, like how I arrived at this, doesn't make a whole lot of sense when we kind of look at it individually in a piecemeal like this. But I'm still doing that just so that you understood like the creation, like the creative process behind it, in case you were ever in the middle of any of it. But when they are all together, you get that, and of course number 2 and 3. You can kind of hear that the main tone kind of comes out of 3. The way that tone works is that number 2, well, being an octave higher is fine the way it is. 3 and 4 are much, much higher than that. And the higher the pitch is, the higher the basic result is. Like it's obviously about like harmonic content, because if you use a higher harmonic in there, then you get a higher harmonic content, but it's also about the fact that this represents that we are moving the thing faster. And so that also means a more intense result, which is why these values are really, really low in terms of how much FM is going on, because the modulation is the volume of these guys on mod X, and that's more or less just straight up and down quiet. So really what we're hearing is that we're hearing this influence on 1 the whole time, but then the volume's coming down on these guys, because in FM, changing how much FM is being applied to something is to change the volume of the thing that's applying the FM, otherwise known as the operator. The modulator is what I meant to say, because there's a carrier and modulator. The carrier is the thing that's being FM, and the modulator is the thing that's FMing. How loud the modulator is how loud the thing is modulated. But the point being is that operator 1 is the only one that's actually on the whole time, but operator 2 and 3 have the volume applying it to itself as well. Why this is important is because if I didn't apply the volume, not only would we not have the FM change, but this very, very sharp transient thing that's happening right now wouldn't happen either. While it would be sharp, the FM transition would be sharp, it wouldn't be this sharp, because now we're also changing volume. And we are able to still have the lower part of it activated more or less the whole time. That was kind of a mistake on my part. I didn't really mean to do that, but that's just sort of how it happened. And I am now just explaining to you why it's happening, and I guess how good it can work. The decision I made later to put the saw wave in here happened after I started to apply effects to it, because it was a little too smooth for my tastes. Now, the first part that makes the sharpness of it, because of the volume change, important is how it interacts with compression. You know, I know why it's doing this, but I still don't understand why it does this. I had to close everything to open that. All right. So the first step here in Maximus is that I'm transient shaping it a little bit. You can see in the original input here how it's pretty sharp in more or less all of the frequency spectrums. And this is the original input here. And so what I wanted to get out of this is that I wanted to accentuate that result in the highs and lows. The lows, because that's where the punch lives. If that's where you want to have that really, like, there's only stupid words to explain what I'm talking about, but like the hardness of how hard a kick hits has to do with how the bass behaves. And if it's hard enough that it affects the bass like all the way down, then it'll maintain its hardness. Like the dynamic range requires that there is activity acting like that, is what I'm saying. And this shape makes that happen a little bit more, but still making it louder. You can see that it gets compressed a little bit up here, but while I'm sort of changing where the top end is, I'm not really changing where the low end is every time with this. But because of the shape I have here, it's coming down faster than it's going up. So while it is going up, it's making it sharper there. On the mids, not so much. The mids I actually did sort of want to keep. I wanted to just mostly just be more together so that you could hear the tone that's going on in the middle, because that's where all the cool harmonics live. So we wanted the harmonics to kind of come up there a little bit harder, and then the highs, a little bit of the same thing with the bass, in that like I wanted the low end to be where the low end was, but I still wanted to be more of it there so that like it's compressed, which is generally why I want to compress things. The results, you can see that like the low end when it's all the way down there, which in the initial input anyway was mostly that anyway. So like in this case we are actually in a little bit of a respect, we're increasing dynamic range because we are making it so that the highs are higher, but the lowest of the lows are still the lowest of the lows. But in this case, it's just because the lowest of the lows are nothing. So in most cases, that wouldn't be really totally cool for dynamic range, because if you see here, like here's the really big peaks, they're really big, and here's the smaller peaks, they're really small. That's dynamic range. There are different peaks. But the technique that accomplishes this result, while it is creating a more compressed signal, I suppose technically it's expansion, but I've never been totally clear on the dichotomy of those two words because I've been focusing on results primarily. On the top of this, I did kind of bring everything back with the limit. And the very last how to base I did, I was just talking about how I was getting away from doing that because it doesn't yield me the results I kind of want. In this example, it did, because I was sort of expecting it to be the end. And the important thing I want to bring up here is what the LMH delay and the attack on the front side of these things do. LMH delay is the same on all these knobs because it pertains to one setting that is applied to all three of these evenly. It is the look-ahead delay that's applied to low, middle, and high. Master has its own look-ahead delay, but it's attached to the attack knob. And why this is important is because it actually introduces real delay. And if you want things to be really snappy, you don't want it to do what it does with the look-ahead delay, because what it does is it smooths the transient attacks and leading up to them. It can be helpful in certain contexts in certain ways, but just not in this particular one. However, if you go all the way down with it, it will basically distort in a particular way. And sometimes it's cool, but in this case, not so much. And it does that because it's responding as its idea of instantaneously to a signal as it then interprets it, and that is only going to distort. So that's why I don't have it as default value, but I don't have it necessarily off either. So that like it has enough time to smooth it enough, but not so much that we are able to detect a real loss in that real snappiness that comes in there. So also about the snappiness, while we're talking about it, there's actually a bit of a global change I had to make this work in the project. And that is I had to increase the project's time-based value, points per quarter. And what this measures, this is a little bit interesting, but what this measures is essentially how many individual like dinky little points there are at any given time. I don't remember what it considers to be a quarter. It's terminology that's based on sequencers in a way, and I'm kind of lost on me. But why this is important is because when we see an automation curve like this, it's not perfectly that. It's not this most wonderful curve happening here. It's some kind of interpolation of that that's based on the kind of timing that's available on the time base, and it's not super obvious even on the regular value of 96, which is the project default. That is a problem. If we go all the way down to 24, we can start to hear it. We can start to hear how like this faster motion doesn't result in the smooth kind of curve, but actually a kind of a blocky business. And what's happening is that, well, this curve isn't smooth. It's basically sampled like it would like regular sampled audio. And you'll think about it, sampled audio works that way because it happens so many tens of thousands of times a second, 44,000 times a second. That's how fast that happens, and we're not really able to perceive that as a problem. And not to mention that we're not even detecting individual slices anyway because it's interpolating a curve as a solution. But in this example, not so much. And there is smoothing. There's actually built-in smoothing in almost everything. And there's also smoothing options in automation that you can do yourself if you really felt like you had to. And in particular, there is a smoothing option inside Citrus right the hell here, which at any PBQ value will do that. But there's a particular downside when you do. That means that your fast stuff that you want to be fast can't be that fast anymore because it's smoothing it enough to the point where it will not create those problems. So if I want to have the hard automation, but I also want it to be, I guess, high enough resolution that I'm not getting that weird little motion distortion in there, I have to have higher PBQ values. This default is usually 96, and the maximum is 10x that, the 960. But I went to 192 because that was the first one that I heard that I couldn't hear the distortion happening. And to be fair, I almost never do this. I almost never actually like have to up the quality of something because I can hear the difference in straight up automation. I did actually attempt manual smoothing, which is to say the actual value of smoothing that you can access, which by the way is done at the value itself. When you go to the control linking window, there's a smoothing option here. There's a 3-pole option where it, I believe it smooths a little bit more sophisticatedly than the first one does. However, it is slower because there's more parts of it that it's doing. I think it's not something I use a lot because it hasn't been an issue, but this particular sound, a particular way that it's smooth, actually did become an issue. And even it was an issue when I had the saw wave involved in it. Because when I have the saw wave, we had that grit back in there. But the thing about the grit when it's a saw wave is that it's consistent. The thing about the motion distortion, I guess we're calling it now, is that it's a product of how fast the motion itself is. So that means that it could be slower or not slower, and it won't be consistent, it won't be tonal. That's why this particular one is a little bit more preferable for me anyway. After that, I did a bunch of random stuff, specifically with Vocodex, but I had a particular goal in mind with these Vocodexes here. If we turn this one all the way up, that is like not a sound I would ever want to have out of a Vocodex. It is not a thing I would consider to be like a decent target for something like this. And while parts of it are cool, the most of the very like obviousness of it, of how like the wateriness kind of goes with it, wouldn't normally be a target. But I had an idea about what happens when you have something like a Vocodex and you use the wet dry knob, or even inside Vocodex itself you use the wet dry to kind of have more of the dry than the wet. And the answer is you get this sort of confused phase pile out of a sound, which normally isn't super wonderful. But I was thinking about what would happen if I wanted to use a phaser for this purpose, because oftentimes you do. Or if I did the manual version of this, which is when you just have a whole bunch of very tightly controlled filter modules, and you're just moving them around so much that you are creating this phase problem. And if that's the goal, then actually doing it with a Vocodex is actually a little bit more efficient, because it breaks the things up into way more of a phase mess than anything else does. And the goal then, even though it really wrecks your signal, like it really does turn it into this strange thing that doesn't have a lot of control anymore. But I wanted to see how far down I could go, and I even put in a delay, which really just sounds like your typical like transformer-y fast delay, where like it's a short time count, high feedback, so you get that metallic echo, which adds up to this just interesting sort of mess. And what I wanted to try and do was essentially fix the phase by compressing the hell out of it again. And of course it isn't going to fix it really, but what I wanted to do is I want to have it be in a position where it's using that to an advantage now as opposed to being a detriment. And the only real detriment is that you basically ruin your level out of it. So just straight up OTT style compression where it's just crushing all 3 bands as hard as you want. However, the position specifically, I've talked about this in the last sound device as well, where the phase of the filters that are creating the splits in the different bands are themselves, a phase thing. So where they are in this context actually is a little bit more important than how hard it's being pushed, because everything's more or less being pushed as hard as it's going to get. The only issues being like if particular higher frequencies are competing against lower frequencies where they might not necessarily want to be, and that's kind of up to you. So that's why a lot of these decisions have technical value, but not necessarily anything beyond that, depending on if you like it or not. And then the top end again has the smaller LMH and the attack values, but also smaller attack sustain and release values, which means that you get this much faster compressor articulation, because I didn't want to like really distort it, because I actually wanted the sound to have a little bit more smoothness to it than usual, but I did want it to be out like tight. And if you look at that seems pretty tight. Unpause. Yay. Although I mean that's got to be distorting it in some way. In certain notes you can see some of them are, when it gets to the higher values, it doesn't actuate as fast as it, but like in the lower values, that's it. That you can see the pattern inside each individual little motion there means that it's faster than the note, and that's how you get wave shaping, which is what distortion is. And then of course some EQ to EQ it. So because of like the double compression going on here, the first one sort of captured the sharp attitude of it that came out of the volume manipulation, which is interesting because by compressing it the way that we did, we sort of removed the literal level change of the volume, but because of much like regular distortion, when you change the volume going into compression, you're sort of altering a character of the sound. And because of the multiband nature of it, it applied itself unevenly to the mids or the highs or the lows, depending on what the curve was that we had, but also like what specific level it was. Because of the mids having to go up meant that the levels coming down here would be up here, but the other guys doing like the opposite of it meant that I was a little bit down. So we in effect used the compressor a little bit like a filter in that regard, but not like directly like a filter. When is a filter not a filter? Vocodex though, like, will kind of wreck how cool that like sharpness feels if you have too much of it in there. So that's why there are pretty low values, and it's mostly to taste like where they end up. As you see, there's different tonal capabilities you can get out of there, and there's probably something to be said about like maybe having a couple more of those in there, maybe automating which ones are which. I did do one where I automated which one Vocodex was the one Vocodex, but that was in terms of like the single chain going all the way through it, not in terms of also mixing in things like dry volumes or maybe even entire other effects chains. This is really a patcher thing that I should be doing, but I wasn't paying attention as usual. This FLP will be available to download in the description of this video. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.